Chapter 1: The Captive and the Captor. Jackson Miles had lived a life that few would ever understand. The stars had always been a constant in his world, but they no longer held the allure of adventure or wonder. For him, space was just the endless expanse that separated him from the things he once held dear: family, purpose, and the camaraderie of soldiers who had all but vanished with the end of the war. The vast, infinite void between stars was a familiar prison, as cold and indifferent as the battles he had fought. No longer in the service of the Federation, Jackson had become a mercenary, working for whoever could pay, often for the highest bidder, and often in the most dangerous corners of the galaxy. The war had stripped him of his ideals, turning him into a man whose only desire was to escape the endless nightmares that haunted his nights. Every drop of blood he had shed had stained his soul, and now, in the aftershocks of conflict, all he had left was the longing for a quiet death in the silence of space. But the silence he sought was something that would not come so easily. It was there, in the wild, lawless regions of the Outer Rim, that he encountered her. His ship, a battered relic from the war, had been drifting for days on the fringes of a forgotten world when he received the transmission. It was a distress signal, one that, in Jackson's experience, meant only one thing: trouble. The message was faint, fragmented by the distance, but Jackson had learned long ago not to ignore such things. There were few people left who could be trusted in the Outer Rim, and even fewer who were worth saving. Yet, something about the transmission piqued his curiosity. It was as though the world itself was reaching out to him, calling him into its embrace. His instincts, honed over years of soldiering, told him that he was about to face something beyond the normal bounty hunts and skirmishes. This was going to be different. He could feel it. When Jackson arrived at the coordinates, what he saw took him by surprise. The planet was a barren rock, its surface covered in craters and deserts, the remnants of an ancient, forgotten civilization that had long since fallen. But it wasn't the planet that intrigued him. It was what he found there, what he had unknowingly stumbled upon. Among the wreckage of a crashed freighter, a group of ragtag slavers was moving what appeared to be a single captive. At first, Jackson had assumed it was just another prisoner, another unfortunate soul who had found themselves at the mercy of the galaxy's darker factions. But as he drew closer, he realized that this was no ordinary prisoner. This was a woman, one whose stature alone would have made any warrior pause in awe. She stood tall, her body powerful and sculpted, her skin a deep, rich shade of violet that shimmered like the surface of a distant star. Her long, dark hair was braided in intricate patterns, a sign of her rank, and her eyes golden, molten, and filled with the fire of 1,000 battles never once left the slavers, even as they hauled her forward like a piece of cargo. Jackson's first instinct was to help, but then he saw the weapons: the bladed staffs, the energy whips, the cuffs that crackled with power. The slavers were no fools. They had captured her, this fierce, beautiful Amazonian warrior, and they were going to sell her as property. He could tell immediately that she wasn't just any prisoner. This was no simple thief or outlaw. She was a warrior, perhaps a queen, someone whose people had ruled with strength and skill, someone who had once commanded armies of her own. But now, she was bound, shackled, her movements restricted by the very people she would have once crushed with a single blow. Jackson's heart hardened as he made the decision. He wasn't in the business of rescuing damsels in distress, especially not ones as dangerous as her. But something about the way she carried herself, the way her gaze never wavered, even in her captivity, compelled him to act. She wasn't just another slave. She was a symbol of strength, a figure who had once been untouchable, and now she was kneeling in the dirt, like an animal on display for sale. There was something so wrong about it, something that felt personal to him, as though he could not allow this injustice to go unpunished. So he made the call. He activated the blasters in his ship, firing a single shot that decimated the slavers' defenses before they had time to react. The sound of their weapons dropping to the ground echoed in the empty silence of the planet's surface. The captive warrior looked up in surprise, her golden eyes locking with his, and for a moment, Jackson saw something flicker in them: recognition, curiosity, and maybe even a hint of fear. He could tell she wasn't used to needing help, let alone accepting it from someone like him. He approached slowly, his gun at his side, and spoke with the calmness he had perfected over years of training. "You're free now," he said, his voice rough from years of disuse. "But I don't expect you to be grateful. Just know that I'm not your enemy." She didn't respond right away, studying him with the intensity of someone who had been in far too many battles to trust easily. Jackson could see the calculating look in her eyes, the wariness. She was sizing him up, trying to determine whether he was friend or foe, whether he was someone who could be trusted or someone who would be her next opponent. Jackson understood that all too well. The life of a soldier had taught him to see the world through the eyes of someone who had learned to doubt everyone, friends, foes, allies, and enemies alike. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and commanding. "Who are you?" she asked, her accent heavy. The words clipped as though she were used to giving orders, not taking them. "I'm Jackson Miles," he replied, not bothering to offer a handshake or any pleasantries. "Ex-soldier, mercenary for hire. And I'm not here to make you my slave." Her eyes narrowed at the mention of the word slave. "Then why free me?" she asked, her voice rising with defiance. "What do you want from me?" Jackson paused, the weight of her question hanging in the air. He had no real answer for that. He wasn't here to gain anything, to earn a reward, or to collect a bounty. In fact, this was the last thing he'd expected when he'd made the decision to intervene. But something about her strength, her independence, even in the face of captivity, spoke to him on a level he couldn't quite articulate. She wasn't just a warrior. She was a leader, someone who had fought for something, who had lost everything, and yet, she still had the fire within her. Jackson couldn't help but admire that. "I don't want anything from you," Jackson finally said, his gaze meeting hers with the unspoken truth of a man who had lived a life of emptiness and loss. "I just couldn't stand by and watch you be treated like this. There's more to you than this life of servitude." For a long moment, Kayla said nothing, her gaze lingering on him, weighing him. Then, as if making a decision, she stood, her movements smooth and purposeful, even though she was still bound by the shackles. "I am Kayla," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had ruled and fought and won. "And if you are truly willing to help me, then you will not make the same mistake the others have made. You will not try to control me, Jackson Miles. I am no one's possession." Jackson felt the sting of her words, but he didn't back down. He wasn't here to control her, not in the way she thought. He simply couldn't let her fall into the hands of those who would break her spirit. "We're not enemies, Kayla," he said softly, taking a step closer. "I'm not here to make you a slave. I'm here to give you a choice." Her gaze softened, just slightly, as she considered him. "A choice," she repeated, almost to herself. "You offer me freedom, but it comes at a cost." Jackson nodded slowly. "We all have a price. But you've got the chance to decide what that price is now." And with that, they stood facing each other in the empty, barren landscape of a forgotten planet. Two people from different worlds who, by fate or chance, had come together at a crossroads that neither of them could have anticipated. One had been captured and enslaved, and the other, once a soldier, now a man seeking redemption. They were bound by the uncertainty of the future, yet there was something undeniable in the way their destinies intertwined. Kayla stood before Jackson, her back straight, her stance as commanding as it had been in countless battles and skirmishes. The air around them seemed to thrum with an invisible energy, a silent understanding passing between them. Despite her chains and the weary weight of captivity, she was still a force of nature. Her sharp, golden eyes never wavered as she scanned Jackson, looking for any sign of weakness, any trace of deception. Jackson, however, stood his ground. His experience had taught him how to read people, the subtle shifts in body language, the flickers in the eyes, but Kayla's gaze was a fortress. She was a warrior to her core, and for a moment, Jackson felt the full weight of her presence, the power she had once wielded, and the danger she still represented. But there was something else in her eyes, something softer than the warrior's pride and cold calculation. There was weariness there, a depth of pain that spoke of endless battles, of lost comrades, of a people torn apart by the very strength she had once commanded. He could see it now, the cracks in her armor, the vulnerability she carried beneath her powerful exterior. She was not just a prisoner. She was a queen in exile, a ruler without a throne, and in that moment, Jackson couldn't help but wonder what had driven her to this point. How had a warrior like Kayla, so full of fire, ended up shackled and at the mercy of slavers? Jackson had seen a lot in his life, but this felt different. He had been a soldier once, fighting for ideals that had long since crumbled. He had fought for something bigger than himself, only to realize that the battles he had waged were not the ones worth fighting. He had fought for power, for glory, for things that had ultimately turned hollow. But Kayla, her fight was different. It was not for glory, but for survival. It was not for the bloodshed, but for the preservation of something that had once been great. And yet here she was, bound and helpless, reduced to a commodity. Jackson couldn't let it stand. "You're free," he repeated, his voice steady, though the weight of the moment pressed heavily on him. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I don't want your loyalty. I don't want to make you my servant. You can leave if you want." Kayla's gaze shifted to the shackles that bound her wrists, the restraints that limited her movements, but not her spirit. "You speak of freedom as though it is something I can simply accept," she said, her voice low and tinged with bitterness. "I have known freedom. I have known what it is to rule, to command my people. But now, I am a slave, a prisoner." Her words cut through Jackson like a blade. He knew the pain of being bound by forces beyond his control. He had seen it in the eyes of his fellow soldiers, men and women who had been forced to fight wars they never believed in. He had seen the toll it took on them, the way they became hollow, unable to return to the life they had known before the war. He had been lucky, or perhaps unlucky, to survive the battles, but Kayla's survival had come at an unimaginable cost. "Freedom isn't something given," Jackson said, stepping closer to her, his voice dropping in intensity. "It's something you take, something you fight for. You fought wars, fought battles, fought for your people. You don't need to let this define you." Kayla's eyes softened for a brief moment, a flicker of recognition passing through them. Then, with a sharp motion, she yanked her chains forward, a loud clank reverberating through the air as she tested the strength of the restraints. The motion was powerful, but futile. She was trapped, her strength rendered useless by the metal that bound her. Jackson could feel the weight of her frustration, the helplessness she tried to hide behind her pride. It was the same feeling he had carried with him ever since the end of the war, a sense of being trapped, of not knowing where to go or what to do next. "I know it's not that simple," Jackson said, his gaze softening as he met her fiery eyes. "But I'm not here to make you a prisoner. If you want to fight for your freedom, I'll help you. If you want to go after the people who captured you, I'll be right there with you. But if you want to stay locked in chains, if you want to be a slave, that's your choice. But don't make it because you think you have no other options." Kayla stood silent for a long moment, her eyes never leaving his. Jackson could feel the weight of her decision hanging in the air, but he didn't flinch. He knew what kind of woman she was, what kind of warrior. She would never let herself be caged. She would fight, even if it meant fighting him. Slowly, Kayla lowered her gaze, her shoulders sagging for the first time since he had met her. For the briefest moment, Jackson thought she might speak, but instead, she nodded once, sharply. "I will not be your slave, Jackson Miles," she said, her voice steady now, though the fire still burned behind her words. "But I will not leave until I have the strength to fight again. You're right. Freedom is something I must take. And when I'm ready, I will take it. But I will not beg for it." Jackson nodded, understanding the weight of her words. She wasn't ready yet, but when she was, she would fight with everything she had. And in that moment, Jackson knew this was no ordinary woman. This was a warrior, a queen, and she would never be anyone's prisoner again. He turned to leave, but Kayla's voice stopped him. "You will help me," she said, her voice sharp. "But know this, you will never control me. Not with kindness, not with fear, and not with your promises." Jackson glanced back, his eyes meeting hers, a flicker of respect passing between them. "I never intended to." And with that, Jackson Miles walked away from the woman who had once commanded entire armies, leaving her to the silence of her thoughts, but also giving her the one thing she had lost the chance to choose. Chapter 2. The Unlikely Bond. Over the next few days, Jackson kept his distance from Kayla. He didn't push her, didn't try to force anything upon her. He had seen too many men, too many soldiers, try to control others through force, through domination. He knew that kind of power was hollow, that it only led to resentment and bitterness. Kayla was no ordinary captive, and he knew that she would never allow herself to be controlled. The best he could do was give her the tools she needed to rebuild herself, to regain her strength, and to give her the space to make her own choices. He spent his time making repairs to the ship, checking the coordinates, preparing for their next move. The slavers had been only one small part of a much larger underworld one that Jackson had no intention of getting further involved in. But Kayla was a different story. He wasn't sure what would happen between them, but he couldn't walk away from her not when he had already made the decision to free her. One evening, after another quiet day spent in the ship's corridors, Jackson found Kayla in the cargo hold, working on a set of discarded weapons she had found in one of the storage rooms. The shackles still encircled her wrists, but she had figured out a way to maneuver them, making small adjustments to the weapons as though she were preparing for a battle. She didn't look up as he entered, her focus entirely on the task at hand. "You're getting better at that," Jackson said, breaking the silence. Kayla glanced up briefly, her sharp eyes narrowing, but she didn't stop her work. "I've had plenty of practice," she muttered. "If I'm going to escape, I need to be ready." "You're not going anywhere until you're ready," Jackson said, his voice calm but firm. He stepped closer, his eyes scanning the room before resting on her. "But when you are, I'll be right here. You don't have to do it alone." Kayla finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with both suspicion and curiosity. "You're not here to control me, then?" she asked, her tone softer than it had been before. "I'm not here to control anyone," Jackson replied, his voice steady. "But I'm not going to abandon you either." Her gaze softened just slightly, and for the first time, Jackson saw a flicker of something that wasn't pure defiance or anger. It was a glimpse of trust, fragile, tentative, but there nonetheless. "Then, what do you want from me?" she asked, her voice quiet but sincere. Jackson's heart clenched, and he found himself answering without thinking. "I want you to have the choice. The same choice I never had." For the first time, Kayla lowered her guard just enough to allow something other than anger and pride to take its place. "I will not be a slave, Jackson Miles. But I will fight beside you. And when the time comes, we will see who controls what." And in that moment, Jackson knew this wasn't just a woman he had rescued. This was a woman who had the power to save him, to pull him from the darkness of his past, and together, they would fight for something greater than either of them had ever imagined. The days began to blur into each other as Jackson and Kayla spent more time together on the ship, navigating the endless expanse of space toward an uncertain future. Their interactions were few but charged with an intensity that neither of them could ignore. The tension between them was palpable, but neither of them pushed it. They had both been through too much, carried too many scars, to rush into something that felt as complicated as their bond had become. Kayla still wore the shackles, her wrists raw from the metal's constant weight, but she had learned to move with them, using her agility to adjust, to adapt. Jackson could see the fighter in her, the woman who had once commanded armies, even now, stripped of her power and dignity. He had offered her freedom, a choice, and she had taken it, slowly, cautiously. She was no longer a prisoner in the traditional sense. The slavers were gone, and for now, there was no one hunting her, no one seeking to control her. But that didn't mean she was free of the invisible chains that bound her to her past. The weight of leadership, of being the figurehead of a once great warrior race, still hung heavily on her. Jackson had seen it in the way she moved, the way she studied every decision, weighing the consequences as though she were still responsible for the lives of thousands. It was a burden she carried silently, and he understood that more than he wanted to admit. He had been a soldier too, a man who had fought for something larger than himself, only to realize that the cause he had fought for no longer mattered. Kayla's past was a history of conquest, of battles won and lost, of bloodshed that she had orchestrated. Now, all of that seemed irrelevant, and yet it shaped every aspect of her. She didn't know how to live without that weight. She didn't know how to be something other than a warrior. And so, the silent tension between them remained, each of them holding back for reasons they didn't quite understand. The moments they spent together working on the ship, exchanging stories, and even when they sat side by side in silence were all layered with unspoken questions. Could they truly work together? Could a former soldier and a broken warrior ever find common ground, let alone trust each other enough to fight alongside one another? The question loomed, unanswered. As the days turned to weeks, Jackson began to realize something. He was beginning to care for her. It wasn't love, not yet, at least, but it was something close. Something he had not felt in a long time. He admired her strength, her resilience, but also her vulnerability, the quiet moments when she allowed herself to rest, when the walls she had built around herself cracked just enough for him to see the woman beneath. And Kayla, in turn, began to see Jackson differently. At first, he had been nothing more than a man who had helped her escape, a mercenary who had done his duty. But as time passed, she started to understand that there was more to him than the scars of his past. He was a man who had been broken by the wars he had fought, a man who had lost more than he was willing to admit, and yet, he kept moving forward. His loyalty, his willingness to stand by her, even when she was at her most difficult and proud, began to chip away at the walls she had so carefully built around her heart. It was in those moments of shared silence, of working together to repair the ship or trading stories of past battles, that Kayla began to realize just how much she needed someone to fight beside her, someone who wouldn't try to control her, but would walk beside her, understanding the weight of her choices. And though she would never admit it, the idea of someone offering that kind of understanding made her heart ache. One evening, as they sat at the ship's makeshift table, a bowl of rationed food between them, Kayla looked at Jackson in a way that made him pause. The golden glow of the ship's overhead lights illuminated her face, casting shadows that danced across the contours of her features, softening the sharp edges of the warrior she once was. She had never looked more vulnerable. "You've been quiet," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was low, almost too quiet. "Tell me, Jackson, what makes you so different from the others I've met? The soldiers I fought alongside, the enemies I conquered, they all wanted something from me. They wanted my strength, my obedience. But you're different." Jackson looked at her, his gaze steady, but inside, a storm raged. What was he supposed to say to that? What did he want? He hadn't allowed himself to consider it, hadn't allowed himself to believe that someone like her, a warrior, a queen, could need or want anything from someone like him. "I'm not asking for anything from you," Jackson said, his voice low but sure. "You're not a tool for me to use, Kayla. You're not an object. And I'm not going to control you. I'm not going to treat you the way they did." He paused, then added, "I'm just offering you the chance to choose for yourself. The way I never got to." Kayla didn't respond immediately. Her eyes held his, searching for something in his words, something deeper. He could see the wheels turning in her mind, could see the way she was processing everything. She had spent her life making decisions for her people, for her warriors, but now, she was forced to make decisions for herself. And it was harder than she had ever imagined. For a moment, there was only silence. And then, Kayla spoke again, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "What if I don't know what I want anymore?" she asked. Jackson's expression softened. He knew exactly what she meant. He had been there. He had known what it was like to be lost, to lose everything he had fought for, to not know what the future held. I think we're both trying to figure that out," Jackson said, offering her a small, understanding smile. "And maybe that's okay. You don't have to have all the answers right now." Kayla looked away, her gaze falling to the table between them, her mind clearly elsewhere. For the first time, Jackson saw a flicker of vulnerability in her that she had kept hidden so carefully. He wanted to say more, to offer her comfort, but he didn't want to push her. Not yet. Chapter 3, The Choice. Days turned into weeks, and still, the tension between them remained. It was neither romantic nor adversarial, it was something more complicated, something that neither of them knew how to define. The air between them crackled with possibility, but also with the weight of the past. They were two people bound by their shared experiences, warriors, survivors, but also two people trying to move forward, to heal from the scars that ran deeper than the skin. Jackson knew that Kayla wasn't ready to fully trust him. Not yet. But the subtle shifts in their interactions told him that she was starting to see him not as a threat, but as an ally. Someone who could stand beside her, not because he was commanded to, but because he chose to. And that, Jackson realized, was the hardest part for both of them. Choosing to be vulnerable, choosing to trust, choosing to let someone into the darkest corners of your heart, that was the true battle they faced. One evening, after a particularly grueling training session where Kayla had pushed herself beyond her limits, Jackson found her alone on the observation deck, gazing out at the stars. The soft hum of the ship's engines was the only sound, a steady reminder that they were moving forward, even if neither of them knew where they were going. He stood for a moment, just watching her, before stepping forward. "Kayla," he said softly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Are you all right?" She didn't turn to look at him immediately, but her shoulders dropped slightly, as if the weight of the day had finally caught up with her. "I'm fine," she replied, though Jackson could hear the weariness in her voice. "Just thinking." Jackson nodded and took a few steps closer, standing beside her, his gaze following hers as they both stared out at the infinite expanse of stars. "About what?" he asked, his tone gentle. "About choices," she said, her voice low. "About what I want, about what comes next." Jackson remained silent, knowing that this was a conversation they had to have, but also knowing that it had to come at her own pace. He wasn't going to rush her, wasn't going to force her into anything. He had made that mistake once before, and it had cost him everything. Kayla turned to face him then, her expression more vulnerable than he had ever seen. "Jackson, you've given me a choice. But I don't know what to do with it. I don't know who I am anymore. Not without my people, not without my cause. I've always fought for something, but now I'm fighting for nothing." Jackson met her gaze and smiled softly. "Then maybe it's time you fought for yourself." And in that moment, Kayla realized something she had known deep down but hadn't been ready to admit. She wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The stars outside the observation deck flickered like ancient beacons in the distance, too far away to ever touch, too old to ever truly matter to anyone other than the light they cast on the lives of those who wandered beneath them. For Jackson, they were reminders of everything he had once known of wars fought, of battles lost, of a man who had once believed in something, only to have that belief shattered. But for Kayla, in that moment, they were something else. They were symbols of possibility, of a future that was uncertain, yet filled with an unspoken promise. Jackson had always been good at understanding people, at reading their expressions and their body language. But Kayla was different. She was a puzzle wrapped in layers of pain, pride, and strength. He had seen warriors like her before, those who fought because it was all they knew, those who thrived in the chaos of conflict, and who struggled to find purpose in a world that had moved on without them. Kayla was no exception. She had fought for her people, for a cause, and now, without that cause, she was adrift, searching for something that made sense, something that anchored her. Her eyes, golden and molten, softened as she looked at him, the weight of her words still hanging in the air between them. Jackson had been right. The hardest part wasn't the physical battle she had fought, it was the battle within herself. Her entire identity had been defined by her role as a warrior, a leader, a queen. But now, with those roles taken from her, she was left to face a woman she didn't recognize. "I don't know how to fight for myself," Kayla said, the vulnerability in her voice something Jackson had never heard before. "I've been so used to fighting for others, for something bigger than myself. But now, I don't know what I'm fighting for. I don't know where to go." Jackson stood there, watching her, understanding her struggle in ways that he hadn't before. He had been a soldier once, someone who fought because he had to, because his mission had been clear. But now, after all the chaos, after all the losses, he was a man who fought only for himself, for survival, for redemption. He had fought his battles and lost them all, only to realize that the true fight was not against others, but against the void that remained when there was no one else to fight for. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," Jackson said quietly, stepping closer, his voice calm, grounding. "You don't have to know what's next. I sure as hell didn't when I left the war. Sometimes, you just need to take it one step at a time. And right now, all I'm asking is that you don't push me away. We can figure this out together." Kayla looked up at him, and for the first time, Jackson saw something change in her eyes. It wasn't just the fire of a warrior, it was the flicker of something softer, something human. He saw the weight she had carried for so long, the burden of responsibility, lifting, just slightly. She was letting him in, and that, for Jackson, was enough. She exhaled slowly, her gaze softening. "One step at a time," she repeated, as though testing the idea in her mind. "I haven't done that in years. Maybe I should start." Jackson nodded, offering her a reassuring smile. "Everyone needs someone to walk with them. You don't have to do this alone." And then, without thinking, Jackson reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. Kayla didn't flinch, didn't pull away. She simply stood there, letting his presence anchor her for the first time in a long while. The distance between them was still there, but it felt less like an insurmountable gap and more like the space between two people learning to trust each other. Chapter 4: The Path Forward. Days passed, and the ship continued to glide through the galaxy, its engines humming steadily as Jackson and Kayla worked side by side to keep it running. The silence between them had evolved, no longer heavy with unspoken words or tension, but filled with a new understanding. Kayla was still a warrior at heart, still a queen in exile, but she was beginning to let go of the past, of the idea that her worth was tied to the battles she had fought and the title she had once held. With Jackson's help, she was learning that she could be more than just a warrior. She could be something else, something new. Jackson, for his part, found himself slowly letting go of his own burdens. He had spent so much of his life believing that he had to be alone, that he couldn't trust anyone again. But Kayla had shown him that maybe it was worth taking a chance, worth opening up to someone who understood pain, who had been through the same darkness, and who had come out the other side, scarred but alive. One evening, as the ship floated through the calm of an uninhabited system, Jackson found himself sitting across from Kayla at the ship's table, the soft glow of the control panels casting long shadows across her face. She was no longer the prisoner he had found in the wreckage of a forgotten world. She was a woman reborn, not through battle, but through the quiet moments of self-discovery that she was now learning to embrace. "I've been thinking," Kayla began, her voice steady but thoughtful, "about what you said. About walking one step at a time." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the table, a small but deliberate motion that made Jackson lean forward slightly. "Maybe I don't need to have all the answers. Maybe it's enough just to be here, with you." Jackson met her gaze, his heart inexplicably light. "I'm not asking for anything, Kayla. I'm not asking for you to become someone else. I'm just asking that we keep moving forward together." Her golden eyes softened, and for the first time since they had met, Kayla smiled, a real smile, one that reached her eyes and lit up the entire room. "You've already given me more than I ever thought possible," she said softly. "Freedom, not just from my chains, but from the burden of who I thought I had to be. And for that, I'll fight beside you. Not because you freed me, but because I want to." Jackson's heart swelled, and for a moment, the weight of everything he had been carrying seemed to disappear. In this woman, this fierce, beautiful warrior, he had found something he never expected. A partner, someone to share his future with, someone who had the strength to fight not just for survival, but for something greater. "I'll always stand by you, Kayla," Jackson said, his voice filled with sincerity. "And when you're ready, we'll find your people. We'll take back what was stolen from you. But until then, it's just us. Just one step at a time." Kayla nodded, her smile deepening as she leaned back in her seat, finally at ease for the first time in years. "One step at a time," she repeated. "And when we're ready, we'll take on the galaxy together." As the ship continued its journey through the endless stars, Jackson and Kayla stood side by side, no longer just captor and captive, but something more, something that neither of them had expected. And in the vast, empty space that stretched before them, they found a new purpose: to walk this path together, to face whatever challenges came their way, and to build a future not defined by their pasts, but by the choices they made in the present. Together, they would write their own story,